we're asked to find all the zeros on this one, and basically what that means is to solve it. We're trying to find what the value of x is. If we're saying find the zeros, because if we were to graph this one, it crosses the x-axis in several different spots, and we're trying to find those, what those zeros are when they're crossing the x-axis. Okay, so with this one, it's x to the fourth power, so we can have up to 4 answers here. And we can plug this one into our calculator. That can help sometimes. Sometimes it doesn't do everything we want because of the imaginary numbers. What I would suggest on doing on this one is to factor it first. Okay, but let's go to the first step here. To find the zeros, we want to convert this g of x here into 0. So we're going to rewrite it, but instead of writing g of x, we're going to write 0 right here. All right, now we can factor it. And we're used to factoring these. If this said x squared minus 5x minus 36, we could factor that one. 36, we need two numbers that multiply together to give us 36, but add together to give us 5. We think about that for a little bit, and then we find out that it's 9 and 4. That would be a negative 9 and a positive 4. Well, the same rules are going to apply here. The only difference is here we have an x to the fourth and an x squared. So if we were to factor these, we're going to follow the same guidelines. Two numbers that multiply together to give us negative 36. But when we add them together, give us negative 5. So that is still going to be negative 9 and 4. So we're going to factor those, but this time, instead of it being x plus 4 and x minus 9, it's going to be x squared plus 4 and x squared minus 9. That's really the only difference here between this and what you've seen traditionally. All right, now that we have this, now we can solve it. We can break it apart as far as we can, see if we can factor it any more. This one, we can factor x squared minus 9 is the same thing as x plus 3 times x minus 3. That works. We could factor that out. This one we cannot factor. If it were x squared minus 4, we could, but it's x squared plus 4, so that is not factorable. So now we have 3 different components here, and these are all multiplied together to give us 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to set each one of these individually equal to 0. So we're going to go x squared plus 4 equals 0, x minus 3 equals 0, and x plus 3 equals 0. And I got that from each one of these components here. We set each of those equal to 0. Now what we're going to do is actually solve each one of them. Alright, so let's go down the list here. We've got an x plus 3 equals 0, so that means I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. I find out that x equals negative 3. Going over here to this one, I've got an x minus 3, so what I'm going to have to do is add 3 to both sides. Then I find out that x equals 3. So x is going to equal a plus or minus 3 here. Now let's do this one here. If we move the 4 over, we're going to have to subtract 4 from both sides. That gives me a negative 4 is equal to x squared. Well, I don't want to know what x squared is. I want to know what x is. So the way to get rid of this squared here is to take the square root of both sides. So now I take the square root of both sides. That gets rid of my x squared. Now I end up with the square root of negative 4. Now, if you remember right, we can't have a negative underneath the radical. When we do, we call that an imaginary number. Underneath a square root sign specifically. So the square root of negative 4, well, the square root of 4 is 2. We have this negative sign that we've got to deal with as well, so that's actually going to be 2i, and it's going to be a plus or minus. It can be either a positive or a negative 2i is equal to x. So now I've got all of these answers here. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 because of the plus or minus, and that was what we thought it was because we had x to the fourth power up here. So now all we have to do is write all of these. I can have plus or minus 2i and plus or minus 3. All 4 of those would be answers here. The big thing to remember is to factor it just like normal, except it's going to be an x squared here instead of just a normal x. And if you end up with a negative underneath the square root sign, that's the same thing as I. So you'll treat it just the same.